Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, everyone who is tuned in to this live webinar, reaching you from the main campus of the University of Zululand in Kwadlange as well. Special greetings to our Vice Chancellor, Chief Provost, Deputy Vice Chancellors, Registrar, our deans, and all colleagues who are here present, as well as all the colleagues and guests who are joining us remotely, and students as well. I am very, very pleased, very, very excited to be given the honor to welcome you all to another loaded edition of this brilliant initiative of the university, the Vice Chancellor's Webinar Series 2021. And the current edition is being hosted in partnership with the Faculty of Arts. My task isn't much at this moment. I'll just like to say that today's program has a very fascinating title, and it is Academic Work. Beg your pardon, 1 second. Well, we will get there, but I just want to remind us that we have a very interesting speaker and a very interesting topic for deliberation today. And just pay close attention, have your notepads ready, have all your mind and all your attention ready. We are going to feast, have a very interesting intellectual feast this morning. I will pause at this point to bring in, for the official opening, our distinguished Vice Chancellor, Professor Oliswa Ntose.
Program Director, Dr. Akon, executive members of University of Zululand. I understand some are not here because there's another activity for the university, so they're holding the fort there. Deans of faculties, academics and students, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Frank. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you once more to the latest in a series of the Vice Chancellor's Public Lectures series. The webinar series were conceived by the Office of the Vice Chancellor as part of the university's commitment to encourage intellectual and scholastic deliberations on its 2 campuses. This is about advancing the university's intellectual project. As conceived, the Vice Chancellor webinar must be seen as a safe space and place to interrogate, explore, and to experiment with ideas. Today's lecture, entitled Scholarship in Difficult Times, Academic Work in Neocolonial Africa, by Professor Kwesi Pra, is meant to do exactly that. It is about what scholarship means in our lifetime, especially in the light of the myriad challenges and obligations that the university has. Universities are living organisms. They don't exist in isolation. They are therefore not immune to the external changes that take place within their environment. Like all living organisms, their survival rests on their ability to respond and to quickly adapt. Adaptation, however, should not lead loss of identity and loss of purpose. Changes in higher education are, however, not new. They have been long in the making since the establishment of a university. While there are certain aspects that are universal, there are areas of distinctiveness that has come about as a result of the process of adoption. It is for this reason that one can speak about an American university as distinct from the British, Scottish, German, Chinese, Indian, or Japanese university. South African universities are so called upon in this country to be part of the broader transformation taking place. As public institutions funded by the public purse, they are also held accountable, not so much about what they teach, but how the tax money is spent. Beyond that, they are expected to play a critical role in the local socio-economic development. I assume that part of the expected deliberations will touch on that perennial question that has been asked by stakeholders interested in the affairs of universities. The question relates to relevance and purpose. The question comes in various guises. In the complex array of attempting to look at the role of a university in society, some have argued that universities should be guardians of reason, inquiry, and philosophical openness, preserving pure inquiry from the dominant public opinions. For others, universities are places that facilitate social mobility. This is an instrumentalist view of a university in the same way that government also expects universities to contribute to the country's human capital development. Unfortunately, in certain instances, these seems noble intentions have been pushed at the expense of some academic rigor. Restoring the balance between external expectations while remaining true to the idea of scholarship is the essence of today's discussions. In addition, we cannot shy away from having to address ourselves to the impact that COVID-19 has had on the services provided by the universities. This has brought back a discussion on the effects of multimodal teaching and learning. We would need, as a university, to find a way of optimizing the benefits of using online platforms, while we also minimize the disadvantages that come about as a result of these platforms. Some have sought to argue that the ongoing digital disruption challenges the very idea of the university. They are argued that the digital environment, higher education content, comes to the student rather than the student going to where the content is taught. They argue that it is about time that universities should make individual modules available for students to choose from and combine across different providers. Such a view risks reducing universities into nothing more than content supermarkets. For now, we hold a view that a university is a community for discussing, debating, disseminating information. Our perspective is to see the university as one, as being the frontier of knowledge. Number two, having a duty to push the boundaries of knowledge. Thirdly, or number three, engage in pursuit of dissemination of knowledge. I wish to thank you for listening, and I have a pleasure of presenting to you Professor Kwesi Pram, who needs no introduction. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Deputy Vice Chancellors, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is useful from the outset to provide a few clarificatory points regarding the key words in this lecture. Scholarship is the production and reproduction of knowledge at the highest levels of human endeavor. While academics are customarily scholars, not all scholars are academics. There are many scholars, particularly in the Western world, who function in the structure of the academy. Academics combine research and lecturing at the tertiary level of education, dispensing the fruits of their intellectual labors, to neophytes and society at large. Universities are the operational terrains of academics. Challenge, debate, questioning, and professing is what they claim to do. The publication of research results and papers represents the ultimate product which expresses the scholarly output and accomplishment of academics. In this respect, the prevailing wisdom and defining mantra, and I quote, "Publish or perish," remains ubiquitous. Academics regard this mantra both with seriousness and hilarity, but publications of quality provide the only universally acknowledged objective measure of the standing, progress, and ranking of academics. They are supposed to be the crucial criteria on which promotions in the academy are justified. Peer review processes and criticism ensure that such publications meet the standards and expectations of colleagues. Where such processes are not diligently and transparently conducted, quality and academic standards are immeasurably compromised. Devotees and practitioners of scholarship and formal teaching have been part of human societies from time immemorial and have been manifest in practically all civilizations in human history. There are some universal qualities which scholars and academics in their varieties display. Serious scholars usually show obsessional and driven intellectual habits in pursuit of knowledge. Objectivity and frankness are invaluable behavioral assets in the discursive world of the academy. We say, and I quote, "Follow the argument wherever it leads," unquote. We need to mentor students and cultivate genius. Genius is not necessarily a gift of nature. Much of it is hard and concentrated labor. However, temperamental, idiosyncratic foibles and quirks are hardly uncommon with scholars. Eccentricity and pig-headedness are also not infrequent among scholars. Rivalries, jealousies, spite, and pettiness are in equal measure to be found amongst scholars and academics. We are, after all, human. However, epistemological questions remain central to the work of scholars. We seek and practice the art of knowledge garnering and their scrutiny, classification, and use. We learn to cherish, love, and value the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. But there are caveats. Some insist that this should be the sole object of scholars. Others suggest societal dedication, commitment, engagement, and the direction of scholarly work towards social change and transformation, even along revolutionary lines. Scholarship and academic work require not only trained expertise and disciplinary competence, but also the necessary resources to satisfactorily support academic exertions. Without resources and other material wherewithal, it is hardly possible to make academic and scholarly headway. In Africa, one of the most incapacitating of factors which hinder academic work is the relative paucity of resources to pursue coherent research without hindrances. Additionally, we need to make sure that our academic institutions are staffed by the most knowledgeable academic practitioners that we can find. If we cannot find them, we must train promising initiates to meet the scholarly challenges that society requires. There's a lot to be benefited from wider but intensive cooperative relations with institutions in and out of the region. During the late colonial period, there were more shared regional institutions in Africa than there are now, in spite of the fact that there are many more universities in Africa today than there were in the colonial period. The University of Botswana in Swaziland, whose staff complement I joined in 1976, had then just lost Lesotho to independence and flag sentiments. A decade earlier, in 1967, in Makerere University, I was part of a regional university, including the University of Nairobi, University of Dar es Salaam, and Makerere University. In colonial West Africa, there were regional research institutes at the highest levels. The advantages of pooling resources and amalgamating capacities are immense. There is a great number of underutilized scope for joint and synchronized research work and teaching in the country by many tertiary institutions we have. Scholarship is a function of literate society. In the social sciences and humanities, a great deal depends on knowing what you want to find and knowing where to begin to find it. Learning and erudition, the result of wide reading and reflection, distills into essences as forms of thought and expression which display the scholastic richness, relativity, and the historicity of ideas. Erudition brings a great deal of meaning and weight of evidence to bear on a narrow field of concern and relevance. And in dialectical fashion, it can knit together a vast area of knowledge on a broad historical canvas. While a scholar in the social sciences and humanities brings out the nuances and subtleties of historically and socially located ideas, in the natural and technological sciences, disciplinary circumscription and depth are the immediate directions and areas of concentration and interest. Encyclopedic reading makes erudition, and erudition lends itself to fruitful transdisciplinarity and intellectual cross-fertilization of ideas. Globally, over the past half-century, higher education has been significantly affected by the thought and practice of the dominant ideas of policy in the contemporary international economic and political order. The consequences of globalization of capitalism have effectively drifted into non-economic areas of social life. These dominant ideas and their practical implications have long reached African states. Adjusting to the transformations, tensions, and the crisis of management it brings is testing the resolve and ingenuity of tertiary education administrations in Africa and many other parts of the world. Until the late 70s, academic work was largely a lecturing, reading, writing, pen and paper work, facilitated by the typewriter. 50 years later, the technologization of knowledge production has revolutionized to a degree which could not have been imagined. Scholars and academics have been technologically empowered. The appearance and results of the personal computer, the PC, like a deus ex machina, has increased our productive capacities to pursue academic and scholarly work. Remarkably, this development of digital technology enhances meetings, activities, and procedures which churn out in no time masses of data. This in turn invites more data production, all of us in the ostensible service of better policy and planning. Broadband connectivity has become a critical enabler for modernizing higher education institutions in the mission of teaching, research, and community outreach. Connecting African higher educational institutions for improved learning, research collaboration, and access to global scientific resources has been on national and global development agendas for many years but has never achieved top priority policy consideration. The higher education sector in Africa falls far behind the rest of the world in connecting to global research and educational networks. The available bandwidth is generally expensive and limited in capacity, and therefore cannot meet the requirements of education and research of modern institutions. The coronavirus pandemic highlighted the urgent need to extend broadband infrastructure even further to facilitate teaching, learning, research, access to educational resources, and the attainment of effective administration in higher education. The advent of the PC has also placed knowledge and information in front of all of us, at our beck and call. Access to endless libraries of information have now become possible. However, we need to remind ourselves that computers, their software and usage are not culturally neutral. Knowledge is structured through the characteristics of computer technology. For example, computer programming languages used are based on a binary system of logic and computer software. Besides having to function within the parameters of computer technology, which exhibit the software designer's pedagogical values and inclinations. Because Western technological companies have invariably had the creative software, educational computing has tended to reinforce Western technological leadership. Furthermore, the Weberian idea of bureaucracy as a rational and necessary feature of efficient and effective modern society and organization is frequently detracted by misplaced formalistic zeal and disproportionate bureaucratism. Bureaucratic access creates sterile and schematic activities and processes which do not serve the prime objects and goals for which such bureaucracies are supposed to serve. These tendencies affect all areas of social life in modern societies. Educational systems are fashioned to serve societies with specific and also compounded sociological and cultural features. They are socioculturally contextual. No educational system represents a pret-à-porter framework fit for all societies. Indeed, all educational systems are recipes which bear directly on distinctive societies and which relate to putative social requirements of the society in question, as envisaged and understood by those who control decision-making in the country. What this infers is that when we take over an educational system, the new society needs assurance that what it has inherited measures up to the needs of the society in question. The new society needs to define for itself its priorities, its short and long-term goals, and recreate or adapt the heritage with the requisite skills to the new society and its priorities. Even where a new society in ethos and organization does not represent a serious departure from the old order, each generation requires to treat the educational system not as an ageless and unchanging procedure, a formula cast in stone, but rather work in progress. Revisitation, reformulation, pedagogical retooling, and the adaptation of focus and content are essential for meeting the challenges of ever-changing circumstances. Thus, the educational system and its curriculum reflect the identity of a society in as far as it addresses concrete and perceived social and historical needs. Critical African stance in this regard is not new. A century ago, as far back as a century ago, in the heyday of colonialism, Orisha Tuke Faduma, who previously called himself W.J. Davis, but changed his name to an African name, pointedly warned that, and I quote, "In an age of scientific progress, it is dangerous to cling tenaciously to one system of thought. No system is the perfect one because of its age or lack of age. Educational methods must not be hidebound, but should be the product of all that is best in present-day methods. Educational methods need careful but not wholesale adoption. Each of them needs careful pruning and intelligent sifting. In addition, here and there should be subtractions." He pleaded that it is a proscription system of education which tolerates no change of methods and procedure. When new and fresh facts are discovered, our old conclusions must be changed. Faduma went on to forcefully say that the only interpreter of the African must be an African, one like himself, with similar yearnings, hopes, and aspirations, unquote. Long before contemporary popularity with the course of indigenous knowledge systems, his views on the matter were salutary. In 1918, he reminded his audience that, and I quote, "A few years ago, very little was heard of the study of tropical diseases in European and American medical schools. The unsystematized native knowledge of tropical herbs was laughed at as superstitious. Today, the resources of the tropics for the well-being of the world are better known. The native African went to foreign countries to study medicine, but knew little or nothing of native herbal remedies," unquote. Now this, remember, is 102 years ago, but I would argue that the thinking and the expression and the idea and its thrust remain with us, living ideas, and they could have been uttered today. With the onset of the post-colonial period, the greater part of Africa, Asia, Caribbean, which had been previously colonized by Western imperial powers, inherited educational systems which in content and form were handed down by the former colonial authorities. Educational systems and curricula which had been developed and utilized to serve colonial intent and purposes were passed on and in most instances consolidated with little and invariably only cosmetic changes. Today, any superficial assessment of the character of the education system in any African country will immediately reveal the enduring legacy of a colonizing imperial power, the Portuguese, English, French, or Spanish. And many African academics profoundly admire, with little reservation, academic qualifications from Europe and North America. We want to note that dominance of minority Eurocentric African elite cultures will be a perpetual constraining feature on social development and may further stimulate rivalries, antagonisms, and conflict on this continent. African students must know the world through African eyes and experience. In both teaching and research, this needs to be encouraged and rewarded. This approach is not suggested for sentimental or idiosyncratic reasons. It is suggested because it is the only way to develop an educational system relevant to African conditions in general and mass society in particular. Two sets of problems beset higher education in the neocolonial era. Firstly, there are structural problems which have to do with finance, the social structures embedded in our educational system, curricula, and the social organization of the educational system. Secondly, there are epistemological challenges in our efforts to produce knowledge pertinent to the short and long-term needs of our societies. This search for epistemological relevance is closely tied to the structural facilities we have created and maintained in and around the higher education sector. Overshadowing these considerations is the central question of the language of instruction in education. Indeed, and I'll emphasize, indeed, little else can be achieved without this. It appears to me that the issue of language is the leading matter which needs uncompromised resolution before we can address the issue of decolonization of education and the wider issues of society. Some factors within these two sets of challenges derive from and fall squarely in our own hands. But there are also issues which are not immediately of our making, conditions which are embedded in the neocolonial basis of Africa's relationship with the rich world, a legacy of clientship and subsidiarity deriving from the colonial experience. What is referred to as educational neocolonialism means that Western paradigms tend to shape and influence educational systems and thinking elsewhere through a process of globalization, capitalist globalization. Given the perceived pressure to modernize and reform in order to attain so-called high international standards, educational policymakers in non-Western countries tend to look to the West. Plus, they may borrow policies and practices that were originally developed and operated and which appear to be effective in a very different cultural context to what their own societies offer. In effecting such transfer, detailed consideration of particular aspects of a culture and heritage of the originating country is often neglected. As far back as 1965, it was explained that the essence of neocolonialism is that the state, which is subject to it is in theory independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system, and thus its political policy, is directed from outside. A conclusion that can be drawn from this is that a state which is in the grip of neocolonialism is not master of its own destiny. Nkrumah lucidly and with exceptional exposition pointed that neocolonialism overwhelmingly concentrates on economic and related consideration, but is almost totally silent, but he was almost totally silent on the cultural implications of neocolonialism. The Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and related institutions were initiated towards the last stages of the Second World War in 1944. The World Bank Group encompasses the operations of 5 component institutions: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the International Development Association, the International Finance Corporation, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, and the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. Their precepts and prescriptions have ordered and presided over the social and economic operation of states across the world. They started out as a global finance and trade supervisory regime for the world, under the aegis of the United States and its allies. Its first loans were geared towards the post-war reconstruction of Western Europe. Beginning in the 1950s, it displayed a major role in financing investments in infrastructural projects in developing countries, including roads, hydroelectric dams, water and sewage for maritime ports and airports. Until the 1960s and 70s, their concerns and interventions were almost exclusively monetary, trade, and financial considerations. But in the 1980s and the early years of the 1990s, a surge of austere economic prescriptions crafted by these international financial institutions were being authoritatively purveyed across the world. Low inflation, balanced budgets, currency convertibility, and export-led oriented production became part of the cries of the day. These institutions operate with structural adjustment policies to adjust and integrate the economies of needy states into the global capitalist order dominated by the West. Their conditionality has enabled these international financial institutions to impose socially astringent economic policies. The World Bank assiduously offered and advanced structural adjustment policies in their implementation from the 1970s and 1980s onwards. With time and consistency, this has become regular fare for client states. The austerity measures that followed the 1980s led to public sector employment losses and sweeping privatization at the expense of investment in other areas of the economies. The ability to withhold or advance liquidity to governments is undoubtedly the preeminent source of the World Bank and IMF's grip on the domestic policies of poor countries. They prescribe formulaic policies which rhyme with their market fundamentalist economic tenets. Commonly, these tenets are described as neoliberalism. It is a deeply tinged conservative theory of free marketeerism, reflective of the interests of corporate capitalism of our times. Deregulation, privatization, state minimalism, austerity, anti-welfarism, curbing the influence and power of trade unions, and a tight hold on money supply have been part of the ideological arsenal. In much of the world, neoliberal economics has distressed rural and peri-urban areas, denuding them of jobs, pensions, schools, services, and infrastructure, as social expenditure was curtailed and capital chased the cheap labor and tax havens of the global south. Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman are recognized as the inventors and initiators of the school. They have been the pace setters of the neoliberal argument. And for our sakes, it is interesting to note that Hayek, who visited South Africa a number of times in the apartheid era, had openly protective opinions about the apartheid state. The World Bank conceived and began rolling out structural adjustments in the 70s and 80s. The austerity measures that followed in the 80s led to the public sector job losses and wide-scale privatization at the expense of investment in other needy and deserving areas of African economies. Since the 1970s, neoliberal theory and practice has extended into novel areas, including cultures, politics, health, education of the acclaimed states. Today, higher education in Africa has become casualty to their niggardly disposition. Market values have become entrenched and their pursuit insidious. This has strengthened the drive towards the commoditization of knowledge. Every factor or operation in the education sector must have a price tag. Every feature of the educational system must be reducible to gross quantification, costing, and calculus. Higher education has increasingly become part of a chaotic economic marketplace. In many African countries, enterprising businessmen and women have established tertiary educational facilities as business endeavors, money-spinning ventures, an industry which is subject to market forces and the profit motive. They produce large numbers of graduates. Very many of these invariably join the ranks of the unemployed masses, or for long periods are underemployed. In these privatized tertiary institutions, the underlying and proven logic is that the larger the enrollment, the bigger the profit margins. Certificates are fetishized. They are coveted emblems of educational and skill acquisition and represent ostensibly the road to prosperity for their holders. What decades ago was denigratingly described as the quote, diploma disease is no longer reprehensible. It is a syndrome which is now indeed considered amply desirable. The economic returns for tertiary education graduate certificate holders are highest in the existent educational systems. In global terms, they represent about 17% in general earnings as compared to 10% for primary and 7% for secondary educated people. These high returns are even greater in sub-Saharan Africa at an estimated 21% increase in earning for tertiary education graduates. Graduates in the natural sciences, engineering, and other technological fields enjoy clear advantage in the labor market. A recent summary of research findings by Nombulelo Precious Mkai indicate that the career category with most unemployed respondents is 23%, was for human resources, industrial psychology, and labor relations. About 15% of the unemployed graduates had majored in government or political studies. Another 15% had majored in accounting or finance, and 11% in economics, psychology, and sociology. Human resources, industrial psychology, labor relations, management, public administration, and politics remain the most popular majors. Yet many graduates in these mainstreams had to wait a long time before finding a job. In particular, the waiting period was longer for graduates who had majored in public management, public administration, and politics. Accounting, maths, education, health graduates had the shortest waiting periods. Those majoring in mathematics, statistics, and engineering took about 7 months less to find a job than human resources and labor relations studies graduates. The latter group were unemployed for an average of 10.5 months. Accounting and financial management graduates took about 3 months after graduation to find a job. So are those who majored in language and communication. Of the graduates who were unemployed, more than 70% were employed in a job relevant in their field, while 27% were in jobs that didn't relate directly to their studies. About half of the latter indicated that they were in jobs requiring lower skills than those they had acquired during their studies. For example, there was a case of a graduate in accounting working as a cashier in a big shop. In today's world, tertiary education remains beyond the reach of the world's poorest and marginalized peoples, the wretched of the earth. In sub-Saharan Africa, only 9% of secondary school leavers continue to tertiary education. This is the lowest regional enrollment rate in the whole world. World Bank documentation claims that countries all over the world are making progress, have taken major restructuring strategies in their tertiary educational systems to enhance their reach and effectiveness. This, I submit, are just fine words. In most of the World Bank documents that you would read, they give a rosy picture of how their activities are making a difference, a positive difference to African conditions. But the reality on the ground is very different from the picture they paint. Every few years, to engage interest and maintain some measure of credibility, newfangled projects are launched with fanfare by the World Bank and its sister institutions. Invariably, with time, they prove to be only limitedly effectual. In this respect, the latest World Bank fad, that is the Africa Higher Education Centers of Excellence project, is to support the recipients to promote regional specialization among participating universities in areas that address regional challenges and strengthen the capacities of these institutions, these universities, to deliver quality training and applied research. It claims that they will use innovative approaches to make sure the students stay, learn, and graduate. Tertiary education is plagued by high dropout rates and non-completion. In South Africa, 40% of students leave in their first year. In Africa, today, COVID-related school closures are dislocating countries further away from attaining these long-term goals. As seen from previous health emergencies, the impact on education is likely to be most devastating in countries with already low learning outcomes, high dropout rates, and low resilience to shocks. Due to learning losses and increases in dropout rates, this generation of students stand to lose an estimated $10 trillion in earnings, or almost 10% of global GDP. I bring these factors to your attention to show that from the end of the Second World War to the present time, ideas emanating from the centers of power in the global West have influenced all areas of our social lives, particularly in areas like education and health. And this has been led by the instruments of global capitalism, of powers of the West. And it's affecting our prospects of producing graduates who are capable of pulling us out of the difficulties, the existential difficulties that most of our citizenry face. These are the issues I want to draw to your attention. As academics in search of relevance in neocolonial societies in the second decade of the 21st century, we need to understand that our relevance is inextricably bound up with the fortunes of wider society. In societies where overwhelming majorities live in abject poverty, where even as academics in our numbers, we are almost only one generation removed from our poor and lowly backgrounds, there is a stirring need, in as far as possible, to locate and link our interests to the interests of the teeming majorities. We cannot afford to lose sight of the fact that our societies will only make palpable progress when the impoverished majorities emerge out of the conditions of material and social depression which surround us all. Our universities should be places where these societal challenges are analytically confronted and addressed. I thank you. Hello?
Hello,
Hello?
Professor.
Yes.
Thank you very, very much. Shall we do that round of applause again? We have heard you. We did have a few moments of technological challenge, but I am confident that at least those of us here have heard the overwhelming bulk of your very fascinating presentation, and we thank you. Colleagues, that is Professor Kwesi Kwakra, our main speaker today, academic work in scholarship in difficult times, academic work in neocolonial Africa. It is my pleasure now to introduce, without wasting further time, the respondent, and I'm pleased to invite Professor M.A. Masoha, who is wearing two hats here, as one of the hosts, Dean of the Faculty of Arts, and of course, the respondent to this presentation, Professor Masoha.
Thank you very much, Master of Ceremonies, Dr. Apobe, for introducing me. Let me start by acknowledging the presence of the Vice Chancellor, Professor Ntose, and the DVC here, Professor Nomlomo, Professor Kulene, Registrar, I forgot Professor Seyer, but the info, and colleagues who are here, and especially those who have joined via YouTube and other social media platforms. Professor Pra, thank you very much for this solid paper that you presentation that you gave to us this morning. And I was saying to Dr. Sharma said that every time when I've got to engage with Professor Pra, it becomes a very, very big, difficult task to do. But I'm really, really grateful. And let me also acknowledge, especially the open remarks by the Vice Chancellor earlier on. There were two important points that she raised, which I think they do connect with what Professor Pra raised, and in defining what a university should do in terms of pushing boundaries of knowledge, and of course, and the idea of a university as a frontier of knowledge in the industries. And I thought that actually somehow captured part of exactly what Professor Pra captured presented in his paper. And I think it's also important that I acknowledge some of the points that Professor Pra raised. I think Professor Pra took us on a journey of what a university does and how the university should work and how the whole operation of what a university should do. And it's a pity, I think, when we started, as Dr. Apobe said, I think I missed Professor Pra's definition of what scholarship is. And I had to pick it up, I think, somewhere during the presentation by Professor Pra going on. Professor Pra touched on a number of issues, and I think part of what he did was to look at the infrastructure of how the university looks like, and he also looked at the human capacity issues about who comes in and who does what. He also looked at process at the university, and very key, Professor Pra touched on governance And I'm quickly going to draw one point that you raised, which is very critical. It's about bureaucracy, which is very difficult. And I think some of us who are coming from outside, I think one of the reasons why we've not actually stayed for a long time with other universities because of bureaucracy. When bureaucracy becomes too much, you tend to run away from it and so on. And then also very critical, Prof, you spoke about the philosophical underpinning, and which is very, very much important in this case. And then you spoke about exactly how universities are currently operating. One of the key issues is about universities trying to emerge and to protect and maintain their images, their branding. And I think this is the very same case now in terms of how universities are so much interested in rankings, also very pragmatic in that sense to say every time when you wake up in the morning, how are we ranked and how are we doing and so on. But the key issues that you also mentioned is about genius cultivation and mentoring of students and so on. But also equally so, touched on what I am actually currently working on, which is what I call academic witchcraft. And by academic witchcraft, I'm referring to the issues that you mentioned about rivalry and jealousy, bullying, and at universities, even within universities, when individuals are bullied. And I'm now drawn to one book which is written by a colleague who's based at the University of Fort Hare, who wrote about zombification at universities, how academic staff are zombified, that they are terrified, and there's no longer freedom in terms of how you think, but you look at the university as a zombification site where you cannot exercise your freedom of thinking and how you look at things and so on. And thank you very much, Professor Pra, for raising that. I want to raise, with your permission, Chairperson or MC, few questions, and they are actually around Professor Pra's presentation. One is about trust, and I've been battling with this question of saying, how are universities trusted by communities? And if we have to go with that question, what do we mean by trust? And I'm raising this because if you look into the history of how a university or the idea of university developed and up to where we are, universities have now turned into business transaction sites. It's about you give me this and I give you that. So the whole idea of scholarship and thinking, it is actually not quite there. And I think one of the conversations we've heard with Professor Siepe was that about thinking. And I think in most cases now, universities are now producing technocrats and not so much in terms of thinkers. And the whole idea of thinking, actually thinking culture, is actually no longer part of it. And I think Professor Pra, as he closed his presentation, the question was, do universities think about the conditions in which they find themselves? As I drive to the University of Zululand in the morning, confronted with taxis, and you look at housing infrastructure around here, and then as you arrive at the University of Zululand, then you are also informed about challenges of water and electricity. Does that really affect me as an academic? How does that affect me? And how does that translate into what I do as an academic? And then in most cases, we find that there is this unity or a delink from what is actually happening around universities and what the university does. And I think that in itself challenges what the university should stand for in this case. And I think it's also the question of trust, because if universities are trusted by the communities in which they serve, then there's definitely not going to be a problem going forward in this case. And I think this issue about trust becomes important. It's about how related are we? Not only related in terms of saying we are having a memorandum of understanding with one community and another community, and we're actually signing them for the sake of actually pushing our own research agendas, but truly, truly engaging with those communities and really dealing with the challenges that are actually faced with those universities. And if I would actually draw the issue of social science and humanities and so on, that universities go to suffer with communities. Universities must feel what communities are feeling. But if a university is not linked with how universities are actually feeling, then that creates a very, very big problem in this case. And I think I wanted us to look at that. And I think this links up with what Professor Pra raised in terms of saying, how far can we take our business as a university and how we teach our universities? And I think this also links with the second issue that I want to say. How ready are our graduates to tackle the problems that are actually going on in communities? And I think this is actually a very serious issue that we need to go back to it. Say, how do we deal with that? Are our graduates ready for that? Are our graduates ready to engage with the problems that are actually going on in communities? This is very, very important going forward. And I think it links with the third issue that I'd like to raise here is about alienation. And I think earlier on I spoke about how linked are we with communities, about are we not training our graduates to be alienated from their communities? And I remember when I got my matric pass, I remember one of the aunts said to me, you know, now it was more like an insult, but it actually meant that now you have passed matric, poverty, you are in shit. And as I was going to the train, coming down to KZN, now I was asking my questions, what does this mean? It basically meant that my community understands my passing and coming to the University of Natal, having to grapple with issues of poverty. They actually saw me as someone who actually had to come back with solutions to the problems that I was actually experiencing in this case. But also equally, so as I was coming back from the university, shuttling between the university and the community, there would be these expressions of saying, but we thought you can think better than us. But you are not like us. We thought you'd actually provide answers, because they were expecting me to become a thinker who would actually push my thinking level to another level. So this is actually one of the things that I think we need to look at, very important. And Professor Pra also raised something about language, which is very important. Language, very critical, and I think as we started engaging with Professor Pra, this whole debate on language has been very key. And I think it's high time that we really get to a point where we address it in terms of what does it mean for the University of Zululand in terms of our language policy and how we're going to push our graduates and making sure that those students that actually leave the University of Zululand actually are equipped around the issue of language and so on. That is very important. That I think is highly important. The fifth issue, which I think Professor Pra touched on it but left it, is about diversity. And I think this takes me back to some of the issues. You know, it would be a challenge if all of us at the university think alike. We should allow diversity. We should allow people to think differently, as long as there's respect for how we actually push our ideas. And that would actually make a university a university. A university must be a portfolio of where ideas are manufactured, where ideas grow, and then where people have got freedom to engage in whatever thinking they are. A university is not an army battalion where we believe in one idea. A university must actually allow all of us to think differently and be allowed, and also allow students to differ with us. And so that students can also take us on. Even those students that we supervise, even if they don't agree with us, let's allow them space to actually think differently from us. But if we are to take a university as an army battalion, then it is no longer going to be a university at all. Now, thinking at a university must drive the business of the university. New innovations. We must actually look at new thinking, new views. Novelty is what actually we should inculcate. And novelty can not only be at a postgraduate level, can also even at the undergraduate level. And one student at the first year student can actually come up with a new idea. And that student must be allowed to think. And when I pick it up as a lecturer or a professor that this student has come up with a new idea, I should be able to nurture that, assist that student to actually grow. So this becomes very important. And I thought, Chairperson or MC, these are some of the few points that I wanted to raise, that if we want to make a university a lovely place, I think one of the things that we must eradicate, and I'm going back to it, is to deal with academic witchcraft. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Masoha. Thanks to our distinguished speakers, colleagues who are joining us remotely, as well as the colleagues who are here with us. The floor is now open for our questions and contributions. We have quite a decent amount of time, I would say. We have a minimum of 30 minutes to take contributions and to take questions. There are already 3 contributions and questions. I'll read them out. The first is from Professor Neocolonialism, who gives thanks, who commends Professor Pra for the insightful presentation, and he asks, so this question is directed to you, Professor Pra. What do you believe can be done to shift the mindsets of our graduates and millennials to embrace Ubuntu, since they, as the future workforce, are increasingly adopting the mantra of me, myself, and I in a highly narcissistic environment, following bad, get-rich-quick at all costs examples from the worst Western practices? I'll put 2 questions together. The second question is from Langa Kumalo. In your view, and I guess this is also directed to Professor Pra because the question came in just before Professor Pra rounded off his presentation. Why is it that African languages were allowed in the church, even translation and translanguaging between the colonial languages and the local indigenous languages were part of the order of preaching? Yet, these African languages were and are effectively proscribed in the school system and the academy, and indeed in the economic new order and modern techno-science. Professor Pra, we would invite your response. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Prof.
Okay, thank you. The first question is with regards to why can't we embrace Ubuntu more consequently. I am convinced that it has something to do with the fact that what we mean by Ubuntu, firstly, what we mean by Ubuntu that is concerned and the need to recognize the sanctity of other human beings and equality, the need to share, etc. Is first and foremost an ethos which belongs to our societies in an earlier stage. If you live in a village in Africa 70 years ago, where all the children grow up together, in a sense, in the playground, where all the elders have responsibilities towards all children, where age and gerontocratic values, values of respect for old age and so on. And old people see themselves as custodians and guardians of the young and the youth. Then it is easy to maintain the ethos of Ubuntu. It is natural and easy. But once you have a society, which is urbanized, where millions, 10, 20 million people live in cities, and where people live in little cubicles and flats and shacks and so on, it is difficult, even though you may be inspired by the sentiments of Ubuntu, it is difficult to be able to carry it out consequently. It's the government which should carry the spirit of that. But also remember that there are dominant groups in our societies. And the dominant groups think first and foremost about their needs. So it's a challenge, it's a big challenge. And I don't think that we are there yet, Africa, that we've reached a point where we can address these issues properly. But I think it is the concern for people. That's the last bit of my presentation. Remember, it was about the need to link our activities as academics with concerns about the people in less endowed than ourselves. This is also the point which Professor Masoha just made, that we have to have community relevance. For me, it ties in with the issues of relevance, the issues of relevance, of concern for larger society. The second question is a question from Professor Langa Kumalu. And I think that's a very interesting question. But I think the answer is not so difficult, actually. You see, remember that when Westerners came to Africa, they had no difficulty accepting the fact that in order to reach the hearts and minds of Africans, they have to use the languages of the Africans. That right from the beginning of Christianity, the question of passing the message on through the language of the people was paramount. This is why the first books that were produced anywhere in Africa, missionaries, was the Bible. They were into the course of reaching the heart. The only way to do that was to use the language of the people. You can't do that. You can't go to an African village and expect to reach the hearts and minds and convince them about the value of Christianity, values of Christianity, by speaking English or French or Portuguese. So I think they have understood that and have maintained that very consequently. On the other hand, in contrast, the administrator, the people of power, were never interested. They were more interested in getting Africans to work with them, for them, according to their interests, according to their requirements. And so they were more interested in creating Africans, a group of Africans who can speak their language so that they can stand as a bridge between themselves and the masses of the society. So I think that's the issue. It points to something else. The third thing is that it points to something. It points to the fact that if you want to reach people in a convincing way and help them to see the world properly and relevantly, they have to use their own languages. They have to use their own languages. This Yeah, we haven't started looking at that issue properly, because most of us are reproductions of the colonial elites. You know, most of us are reproductions of, and we still maintain educational systems which are like that. If you go to so-called Francophone Africa, you'll find that the university structure is just like the French system. If you come to the former British Africa, you have the same thing. You organize the whole structure of the educational system reflects that colonial heritage. So we have a battle. We have a long, drawn-out battle, and we haven't started. We haven't started looking at it yet. Not seriously. Talk about it, but we haven't started. And until we do this, until we place our culture, our languages at the center of everything we do, we have no chance of solving the large questions of our society. We cannot operate Ubuntu in English.
Thank you so much, Prof. That's a very powerful soundbite. Do not be surprised if you find it somewhere. You cannot operate Ubuntu in English or French, but that's already a takeaway for me. And there's something you raised that if I do have time, I'll come back to. But here's another question from Professor Khumalo. We'll take these two questions together. And the first question, I think it also is directed to Professor Pra, but I think the second, Prof. Masuka can take a shot at it. The first question, which is the second question from Prof. Khumalo, says, in the advent of 4IR, which is the fourth industrial revolution, and the affordances of artificial intelligence, in the context of what you have painted as circumstances challenging the African Academy, akin to giving a double amputee post-World War II a state-of-the-art modern car without attending to their limitations? The way I understand it, are we, in the context of technological advances, are we giving people who are unable to help themselves, are we unable to help ourselves with the tools we are given? So I think I'll let Prof. Pra have a go at this before I take the other question, which I believe is directed at Prof. Masoha. Professor Pra?
Dr. Pome, please, could you read the question as Langer Khumalo presented it? Because
okay. In the advent of 4IR and the affordances of artificial intelligence, in the context of what you have painted as circumstances challenging the African Academy, akin to giving a double amputee post-World War II a state-of-the-art modern car without attending to their limitations?
Yes. My reaction to that question or that issue is that part of our difficulty in Africa is that we receive products, technological products from elsewhere, from the world, without some sort of coherence between the society producing that technological innovation and what exists on the ground in Africa. Let me give you an example, a crude example. There was a book by a man called, there was a book about how trade in Africa by Westerners 200, 300 years ago impacted on our societies. So he gives an example of a mirror, because Africans were fascinated by mirrors and brandy and schnapps and smoked pork and that sort of thing, little things which are sold to us. Remember, we used to sell our own brothers. Africans did that for things like schnapps, for things like mirrors, for things like beads. when there is a disconnect between the capacity of the society, the products that it produces and sells, and the receiver, the people who buy, any little problem becomes a serious problem. If you have a bolt in a car from America, which is 6 inches, and you sell the car in a country where they don't produce bolts, then just the fact that the bolt is faulty means the car will not be able to run. So there is a tie between the technology and the technological society which produces things and where the things are utilized. There has to be some sort of harmony. There has to be some technological capacity in both the seller and the user society to be able to utilize whatever products that we're talking about.
Thank you so much, Prof. Pra. The second one it comes from a participant whose device, I'm sure it's not the person's name, the device is 27747, so we don't have the person's name on this side. Very good presentation by Professor Pra, enjoyed. Prof. Pra and Prof. Masoha, what priorities should public universities prioritize now? More specifically, UniZulu. Who really holds the agenda? There seems to be two questions. Who really holds the agenda? Financial resources as a so-called yardstick. So those are the questions. Professor Masoha.
Professor Sepe, when I listen to the question, I would say, my goodness, this is the end of my job. The University of Zululand. But I think the question is very important. And I think with your permission, MC, I think you should also allow Professor Pratt to air his views on that. As someone who's coming from outside and associated with the University of Zululand, I think it would be important. For me, I would say, I think the question on language is very important. And what I know is that we have already started with this, the African thought agenda, which is important. What I would request is that we need to speed this thing up a bit. It's something that worries me, and I'm speaking personally, and I think this question is about how I feel about it. One thing that I am excited about it is that the University of Zululand has taken a position in terms of now mainstreaming our business, that African thought has got to be the business of the university. But now it's a question of now really knocking it down in terms of nuts and bolts and saying this is what it means. And I think we've started with that. But then one issue is that we need to have everyone coming to the party and ensuring that whoever is actually in a classroom, whether you are doing it with e-model in terms of teaching and learning, so that actually drives the agenda in terms of teaching and learning. In terms of research, that has got to be part of it. But I think even when we go outside the University of Zululand, we need to also be very serious in terms of the kind of message we're going to say. Because I think it creates a problem when you hear that a colleague has said this, but the university stands for this. I think that should actually be, for lack of a better expression, should be the Bible or the hymn book we should all sing from. We should sing from that. So the idea of the African thought, changing the university so that we drive, because this is agenda, as much as we engage with the rest of other colleagues outside in terms of what they do, how we collaborate. But we should define ourselves in terms of our business at the University of Zululand. And that is very important. But I'm actually looking at the situation 5 years down the line, and it would actually be a problem if we have a thesis or a dissertation which departs from that thinking. So I want to see this also translated in terms of the research which is going to come out of the University of Zululand. I would like to see this in terms of how we're going to look at the type of publications that are going to come out of at a later stage. So I think we have this expression, MC, of saying of saying we should walk the talk, not rather than actually say something and then we go elsewhere. But linked to that question that was asked also talks about the agenda. The idea of a university in South Africa is a very complex one, and especially when you look at the whole history of higher education in this country, because you cannot divorce it from the political situation of this country. You can't. I mean, whether we like it or not, they are actually related in this case. Even if people would actually still come back and say, no, let's not talk about inequality and so on. It's part of what we experience. I mean, some of these institutions came out of that situation. And unfortunately, we've got to deal with it. And then this is also now compounded by the situation where you have the state that actually now supports universities. And then also in the context of inequality, you have those universities that are actually doing okay financially, but you also have got to look at the history of where this is coming from. Then you look at us here, who are, despite the challenges of resources, that we are still trying to do our best, regardless of that. But I think we are balancing as a university. And I wanted to say to the person who asked that question to say, we know the history and we cannot ignore the history of higher education in this country. And it's something that we're going to live with it. And I think it's a challenge. We should also remind our education, part of our education, in terms of where we're coming from and where we're getting to. But we can't run away from this historical framing of where we are as a University of Zululand. Thanks.
Thanks, Prof. Masoha. Prof. Pra, your take on that question, please.
Yes. I think I would point to the issue of language. I'm convinced that and it's not just a problem of UniZulu, it's a problem not of South Africa even alone. It's a problem of the whole of Africa. I mean, non-Arabic Africa. The whole of sub-Saharan Africa, it's the same problem. And we are unique. Africa is unique in that respect. There is nowhere else in the world where you will go and find that higher education is dispensed in languages which are minority, very, very at best, very small minority languages anywhere else in the world. If you go to Asia, even the Asian countries which are colonized are using their own languages now. You see, throughout Europe, an area like Europe, every country uses its own language for education. You find the English use this, French use this, Italian use this, Germans use this, Dutch use this, Norwegians use their own language. Everybody uses his own language. We are the only large people who use colonial languages. And then we pretend we don't understand why we are failing until we go back to our own languages and develop our languages and intellectualize our languages. We can't solve our problems. This is the heart of the problem of Africa. And it's not a problem peculiar to any one country. It is true for all of us. If you go to the northern part of our world, where Africans were Arabized, changed from Africans culturally to become Arabs, they're all using Arabic now, although some of them were colonized by the West. The Turks colonized places like Tunisia Libya, Egypt was colonized. So it's a problem which is a huge problem, but the answer is clear and it's very simple and clear. The Koreans, look at what South Korea is doing now. They do everything. They are the leaders of the world in some technologies. But Korea was colonized by the Japanese between, I think, 1910 and 1945. In the 30s, they forced the Koreans to use Japanese. They started changing from using Korean to Japanese. After the war, the Koreans went back to their own language. The Vietnamese do the same thing. The Vietnam was French. They changed it promptly. Now they manufacture every technology because knowledge of these technologies become knowledge which is accessible to the whole society. And we are stumbling. We are not making that move. Why are we not making that move? Because we, the elites, the so-called educated, don't want to do that. We talk about wanting to do that, but we don't want to do that, really, because it's not in our interest, because our positions of power in our societies are based largely on the use of the colonial languages. That's the truth. That's the simple truth.
Thank you so much, Prof. Pra. There's one further question from Prof. Khumalo, but I want to crave his indulgence to take this your point further a bit. And I'm going to preface it quickly. Yesterday, I listened to a presentation by our own Prof. Siepe in a forum organized by University of Mpumalanga. And he gave this, towards the end of his presentation, he said something. He quoted the title of a book that really grabbed me, where someone said, "What has brought you here? What has brought us here will not take us there." And I find echoes of that in what you are saying. Is it possible then that we need a change in the leadership of the universities? Because you made the same point when you made the inaugural VC's webinar presentation, that innovation would be kind of impossible if we keep this. And those of us, those in charge of the University of Academia in Africa, have no incentive to change the situation. So are we looking for a complete change? I see an intervention coming from Prof. Nomlomo. Do you want to go before Professor Pra? Yes, please, Prof, go.
Thank you, Chair. No, thank you very much for the opportunity. I would like to request Prof. Pra if he would be able to expand the notion of the intellectualization of African languages. Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's been going on now for decades. And if we can perhaps elaborate as to say what would be the practical terms, especially in higher education at this point in time, of advancing the intellectualization of African languages. Where do we start? What are the issues on the ground? Can you give us some insights in terms of how do we go about making sure that we give that intellectual significance to our African languages, particularly in higher education? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was Prof. Nomlomo of DVC Teaching and Learning. It seems to me, Prof. Pra, if you do not mind, I hope it's not going to be an overload, because the question from Professor Langa and from Professor Ndlovu we have now are in the same line, I guess. So maybe let me read them out. I think you might be able to take them in context. If not, we can also do them one by one, because I see we still have some time. So this is Professor Khumalo's question. He says, Prof. Pra, can you hazard the point that it is impossible to innovate in a foreign language? There's a full stop there, but my sense is it's a question. Then his next sentence is, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought this sharply to the fore. Is it not surprising that we are the only ones who haven't even attempted to create our own vaccinations? That's the questions from Prof. Langa, Prof. Kumalo. And then the other question from Prof. Mlovu says, what are you saying, Prof. Morgan Mlovu, what are you saying regarding what you are saying regarding language is very important, Prof. However, we also have a problem vernacularizing colonial language in the name of promoting African languages. Is it possible to promote our languages without just increasing the distribution of colonial ideas? So those are the questions. I hope you might take them into context and response. Professor Pratt.
Please, Dr. Bagugu, please, can you read the last bit of what you said again?
Okay. This is the question from Professor Morgan on the language issue. What you are saying regarding language is very important, Prof. However, we also have a problem of vernacularizing colonial language in the name of promoting African languages. Is it possible to promote our languages without just increasing the distribution of colonial ideas? Then as a writer, he says, I mean vernacularizing colonial ideas. So perhaps his second question might read in this way, if I understand it correctly. We also have a problem of vernacularizing colonial ideas in the name of promoting African languages. So is it possible to promote our languages without just increasing the distribution of colonial ideas? I think I've got it. That's the question, Prof.
Well, okay, 3 issues. Let me see if I can conflate them. Professor Langa Kumalo is making a very important point. The question is whether it is possible to be innovative, creative, inventive, in a serious sense of the word, in a foreign language. Well, I would say it is very difficult and unpreferable, because it doesn't work easily, and it's not the object. The object is not to produce information and knowledge to be consumed more by people outside than inside. So I think the question of innovation in a foreign language is you starting from a limited, handicapped position. See, if you don't know a language, if you can't control the language completely, then your ability to be subtle, to be nuanced, to be scientific, to be detailed, to micro-project your ideas is well nigh impossible. It's difficult. In fact, that is part of our difficulties. You can't compete with an Englishman in the manufacture of any goods in English. You can't compete with him because that's his language. He can think in more detail, subtlety, refinement, precision, accuracy. He can project that in the language more easily if it's his language, his own language. And to try to do things which nobody else is doing is, I think, foolish. If the whole world, in order to move forward, resort to using our own languages, if the French do it, the Germans do it, the Russians do it, the Chinese do it, the Spanish do it, the Vietnamese do it, the Indonesians do it, the Malaysians are doing it. I think it's very foolish to say that, oh, I'm going to do something else. It's like saying that I know the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, but I'm going to create a situation in which it rises from the west and set in the east. It's absurd. Answer is simple. Do it the way everybody else does it. We are the bottom of the heap, and we want still to stay there by making arguments which have kept us at the bottom of the heap. That's my response to that first one. Regards to COVID and why we are not able to produce our own vaccines and administer them. Now, it ties to neocolonialism, and it goes back to the capacity to do it. If we operate under the aegis of the World Bank, they don't allow us the patents. A lot of the work is patented by big corporations, transnational corporations, and they refuse to allow you even license to do this, that you have to bargain with them, and they'll take a huge part of whatever money comes out of it, and subsidies which you put in, they will take. So that is tied to the people who control money in the world. And unfortunately, reach that level of innovation which will allow us to start from scratch and patent our stuff and have the capital to do that. We must do these things ourselves, and we must be systematic about them. I agree with you that when you see the politics of vaccination and so on, hoarding of vaccines and the dispensation of vaccines, as if it is through feelings of charity and kindness, instead of being representative of our own collective interests, you see the size of a problem that we face. I think we will have to battle slowly this problem of creating, indigenizing knowledge. The third question is with relationship to intellectualization and vernacularization of knowledge. Well, if you don't use your language, and if you translate everything from outside into your language, there is a danger. It's a real danger. Of course, it is natural that you would not be able to help yourself, that you would not be able to develop it. Because if you read textbooks, history textbooks, the history of colonization in Africa, the history of slavery in Africa, etc., and it's written in the West, they write it from their viewpoint. That's natural. Everybody writes from his own viewpoint. They do it. So if we go and borrow those books as textbooks, and we use them without realizing or without paying attention to the fact that these books were not only written for us, they were not written with us as at the center. They were written about us, but for other people. And it all boils down. It comes round, and it comes to the issue of language. If we want to be able to write history textbooks to train our children and open up their minds, we must write textbooks which place Africans at the center. We are the center. Just like Chinese write books which sees China as the world, the center of the world. Europeans do the same thing. We must do the same thing. We cannot.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Prof. Pra. There are a few comments I'll read. We're running out of time, but that's how it always happens. It begins to get thick towards the end. And there's a comment from a participant identified as Bless P. Very informative presentation and conversation from both Prof. Pra and Masoha. The issue of language is a very important one. As Prof. Pra has noted, we have not yet started addressing our problems if we still operate in the language of the oppressor. I'm sorry, I can only take a part of that. There's another from, I think this is Dr. Mwango. It says the language that one uses has the power to control one's thoughts and even shape how one expresses himself. And yet another one from Professor Logu. Yes, the issue of language must be done concurrently with changing the terms of the conversation regarding knowledge in general. And if I might be allowed to sneak this in on the issue of COVID, we aren't making vaccines. But why it seems our only expertise is in detecting variants that we get a knock on the head for. And I hope that my son actually said that he hopes that changes. Colleagues, it is my pleasure to now invite DVC Institutional Support of CIEPE to say a few words before we hand over to Dr. Shamasi for the closure. Thank you.
Yeah, I just felt I need to thank Professor Pra for having been with us throughout the journey this very year and last year, and also to indicate that these conversations that we have, I've already suggested to him and also to Professor Masoka that they need to be captured. And I think the questions that have been raised right now around the issue of language, Professor Masoka, I think we should take them to the next level. And Professor Brian has written quite extensively around that. And one of the biggest challenge we have in the continent, it is the African elite. It is, and that can be shown. This is why we still have a crisis. But also the whole notion of even innovation. I mean, what is most embarrassing, which reflects the extent of neocolonialism, is how our leaders themselves spend more time begging. You know, when other countries were busy trying to deal with the COVID-19, they were trying all sorts of vaccines. But what do African leaders, what were they doing? They were complaining about how the vaccines are not given to them. So you ask what happened to, why would Cuba try a country as small as that, have its own attempts, 5 different vaccines to try to deal with the challenge that they face. Yeah. But all African leaders can do goes back to your point that what got us here won't take us there. That even when you think you are free, you are still a slave in a sense that you still want the master to provide you with a solution for where you're going to sleep, where you're going to eat and all that. And that is actually, when African leaders do that, they do it with a sense of pride, which is the most shocking. And that also explains why we cannot even, something that comes so naturally, that you speak in your language. I mean, and as we know that nature does not write its laws in English or German and all that. And I keep on saying, when I fall, I don't fall in English, I don't fall in Germany and all that. But it is Africans themselves who will tell you, how would you do it? Instead of, they also want an answer. And they don't ask a question, why are other people finding it so easy to do it? And if you ask yourself that question, then you understand that part of the problem is that you've been colonized. You're so colonized that you cannot even think. You expect that the answers will come from other people, so that the very same people who made it so difficult for you can actually become the ones who are going to give you a solution, when in fact, it is their position to place you there. And Professor Ndlovu, the point that you also raised is that even when we move into that, as Professor Pra says, that we need to understand that we need to put the African in the center. It is not simply an issue of translation. It is also understanding that these documents, these books, textbook, there is an agenda that locates African in the periphery. So that when we move into that space, it is also about changing the terms of engagement, in as much as we're talking about the changing the terrain of engagement. So I thought I would want to say that and to thank Professor Pra for the preparation, but also to say the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, or what do you call it now? You have a new name. We have a responsibility to take this to the next level. And these probing questions are suggestive of the, let's call it an intellectual assignment, but also to address the challenge that Africa and ourselves. And as Professor Pra indicates, no country in the world has ever developed on the basis of a foreign language. And we need to make sure that the best way of connecting with our people and making sure that there's massification of knowledge. And when we talk about massification of knowledge, it is also about making sure that we're taking advantage of the intellectual resources that exist in our people. Because if you look at the statistics, because of the issue of language, very few kids are able to get through. A majority fall by the wayside, not because they're not bright. And then you are subject to this test, they call international tests. And then they show that an African child is incapable of even making sense of something when you know that that African child can make sense of that. But even to subject a European or American child or Japanese to tests that are written in a language that is not their own or context that is not their own, they'll also perform poorly. But again, it simply speaks to the persistence of the colonial enterprise. And as I said yesterday, that the colonizer lives twice, as himself herself in a physical sense, but later lives in the mind of the oppressed or the colonized. And unfortunately, the educated are the most colonized of all people. And we who have the benefit of being here to grapple with this should actually do something about it. So that's all I wanted to say.
Program Director, Dr. Akpome, thank you for organizing faculty seminars and faculty-linked Vice Chancellor webinars addressed by eminent scholars and local academics. This particular webinar address ranks amongst the best ever. Thank you, Dr. Akpome. Chair of this platform, Professor Siepe and DVC Institutional Support, the success of your branding of this academic institution has catapulted it into greatness. And we command respect not only within the borders of the boundaries of the land, but in the continent and beyond its borders. Your commitment to a turnaround strategy for this institution has seen a move from virtual obscurity to unprecedented heights. Thank you, Professor Siepe, for selfless contribution to the betterment of this university and for being a good ambassador on print media and on various television platforms. And I can assure you that your narratives and political analysis, contrary to the likes of the Prince Marshall and others, which are thought by emotions and in some form of impudence, yours is a true representation of the voice of wisdom. Thank you, Professor Siepe. Hail to our Vice Chancellor, Professor Mtose, for her outstanding ability in identifying and attracting the best talent and seasoned scholars. Listening to your opening address compels one to rank you amongst the few women leaders of the world. And scripturally speaking, you are the reincarnation of the distinguished woman leader, Deborah, which others refer to as Deborah, found in Judges chapter 5, verse 6 to 8. I'd like to see this move. Dr. Akpome, I'd like to see this move up. I'm failed by what I have here. Oh, yes. Thank you. The book of Judges, chapter 5, verse 6 to 8 reads, in the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were deserted, and travelers went by roundabout ways. The peasantry ceased. They ceased in Israel until I, Deborah, arose until I arose, a mother in Israel. So, Professor Mtose, you have indefatigably risen to be Mother Vice Chancellor par excellence for this university. It is during your reign as Vice Chancellor that this institution embarked on a new growth trajectory. Thank you, Professor Mtose. We also pay homage to a seasoned scholar par excellence, Professor Pra, for his thought-provoking address on scholarship in difficult times, focusing on academic work in Neocolonial Africa. Notions of mentoring students and cultivating genius, among others, from your address today, reverberate in our ears and minds, and will continue to do so for days, months, and years to come. Thank you, Professor Pra. We salute our intellectual dynamo, Professor Masoka, Dean of the Faculty of Arts, for the simplification of today's intellectual engagement. It is during your tenure as Dean of the Faculty that we have witnessed tremendous improvement in the scholarship of teaching and learning, research, and community engagement. And needless to say, the Faculty of Arts has been catapulted from the veil of hopelessness to the blazing skies. Thank you, Professor Masoka. Now, let me conclude by thanking Deputy Vice Chancellors who are part of this historic trajectory. I'm now talking about Professor N. Bunene, who is the TVC Research, Professor Nomlomo, TVC Teaching and Learning. Thank you for your presence here. A special thank you to colleagues from the Faculty of Arts in particular, all faculties in general, and scholars from all over the world, through YouTube, of course, for being part of this webinar addressed by Professor Pra. Last but not least, thank you to Mrs. Trinantlego and your team at Communications, assisted by ICT's Ms. Makubane and Ayanda Zwane, for making this webinar a resounding success. It is well with you today, it is well with you tomorrow, it is well with you forever. Thank you.
You can disconnect it. You can disconnect. Okay. I've been.